Hello and welcome to Writing Today. In this episode, I'll be talking about genre fusion. But before I get into that, I'd like to remind you that I've started a second channel where I'll be hosting my short stories. If you're interested in an original show and some creepy short stories, then I recommend you check out the Aurora Files. There's a link in the description to the channel. So if you're interested in some audio fiction, you can also listen to it on YouTube or on Spotify. With that said, let's talk about genre fusion. Now, we often like to breathe life into different genres by including elements from other genres. The reason we do this is because often the tropes and cliches tend to build up a little too much, so it makes our story a lot more predictable. So what we have is genre fusion, where we include enough elements from a different genre in order to make the story feel a lot more unique. And there's no genre more deserving of genre fusion than fantasy. So with that said, let's talk about how you can do that with your story. In the world of fantasy writing, there are infinite possibilities for storytelling. However, the incorporation of multiple genres into one narrative is a technique that can elevate a story to new heights. This blending can range from subtle nods to other genres to full-on integration. The benefits of genre fusion are many. It adds depth and intrigue to your story while broadening its appeal beyond traditional fantasy readers. When considering which genres to fuse with fantasy, it's essential to look at compatible ones that complement the fantastical elements. Popular genres like romance, mystery, horror, or steampunk can be effectively blended with fantasy. For effective genre fusion, a strong foundation in fantasy must be established. So if you're interested in learning how to better write fantasy, I have many videos as well as a course on writing fantasy. With that said, there's even a link to a free writing course when it comes to fantasy world building in the description below. Now let's talk about incorporating those elements. For example, if you're fusing romance with your fantasy story, then exploring romantic themes without getting sidetracked from the main plotline should be considered. Some popular examples of genre fusion include The Hunger Games, which incorporates dystopian themes within action-packed adventure, The Mortal Instruments, which combine urban fantasies with young adult fiction, or The Princess Bride, which blends comedy with swashbuckling adventure. So if done right, you can properly complement your story with its inclusion of a different genre. Of course, it's all easier said than done. Now that you have a better understanding of what genre fusion is, let's talk about finding compatible genres for your story. But how do you go about selecting compatible genres to blend with fantasy? Well, let's explore different genres that can be effectively combined with fantasy and discuss the importance of selecting ones that complement the fantastical elements. Now, the number one most popular genre that does a fusion with fantasy is romance. Romance adds an emotional depth to a story by exploring relationships between characters. It can also provide a sense of conflict in a way that complements the fantastical elements. For example, in Twilight by Stephanie Meyer, it blends romance with vampires and werewolves to create a unique love triangle. Another compatible genre is mystery. Mystery can add an element of suspense to a story by creating plot twists and unexpected endings. Adding mystery elements into your fantasy narrative can keep readers engaged as they try to solve puzzles alongside the characters. An excellent example of this combination is The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. Horror is one of my favorite genres to work with when it comes to fantasy, and it can work well if done correctly. When combining horror with fantasy, it's essential not to overshadow fantastical elements though, as it can be very easy with this genre. One example of successful horror fantasy fiction fusion is Neil Gaiman's Coraline. In this novel, Gaiman uses dark imagery combined with magical realism to create a sense of dread throughout Coraline's adventure into an alternative world. Now, steampunk is the result of a fusion between two genres, well, kind of like three. Steampunk uses science fiction, fantasy, and sometimes historical fiction. It's such a popular fusion of genres that it's become a genre of its own. One popular example of steampunk being Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn series. Combining steampunk elements with your fantasy as well can add sense of adventure and exploration to your story, creating a unique world that readers will find captivating. Perhaps if you have a large world space, there'll be a certain part of this world space that uses steampunk technology. So that can add an interesting twist to your world space, as well as make sure that your genre is a fusion of many other ideas. So there are many genres that can be used to complement fantasy, and you need only find the one that best suits your story. Now, I've already given you a few examples now and explained how they work together, but another great way to find a genre that works with your story is to look at other writers and their stories. And don't forget to understand the feeling that you're trying to create. If you're trying to create a more dark fantasy story, then perhaps combining it with darker genres like horror, thriller, or even mystery might help you there. However, if you want to create a more light-hearted story, you would explore different genres such as science fiction or steampunk, which can add a nice charm to your story too. But before you can really do that, you need to establish the fantasy foundation. So let's quickly talk about that now. It's essential to have a strong fantasy foundation. The foundation is the backbone of your story. It's what sets your world apart from others. Without a solid foundation, combining genres can become messy and even confusing for readers. Creating a compelling fantasy world involves developing unique rules and elements that make your story stand out. It requires careful consideration of every aspect of your fictional universe, from geography to politics to culture. It's no wonder that so many of the kings and queens of fantasy writing often take a lot of time off to do some world building before they actually plot their story. Your world should, after all, feel alive and real with its own history and mythology that makes sense within the context of the narrative. And this can be a very tricky balance to work out, which is why it's often the case that some fantasy writers like to set their fantasy story in a modern and well-known setting. However, if you want to create an impactful and unique world, then the foundation is incredibly important. And one way to establish a strong fantasy foundation is by creating a map of your world. This not only allows you to visualize where everything is located, but also helps you to keep track of different factions or groups within your story. A map allows readers to immerse themselves in your world more fully and understand how different locations relate to each other. Another crucial aspect of building a strong fantasy foundation is developing unique magical systems. Now, we've talked about that recently. If you want to check out my previous video on creating a magical system for your fantasy story, there's a link to that in the description below. But I'll quickly say this. Magic can be an excellent tool for blending genres if done correctly. For example, incorporating horror elements into magical spells or rituals can create spine-tingling moments that add depth and intrigue to your story. Nothing's more scary than magic that is truly damaging or terrifying, rather than magic that simply makes lights twinkle. Lastly, don't forget about character creation when establishing your fantasy foundation. Your characters should feel like they belong in this fantastical universe you've created, while still possessing relatable human qualities that the readers can connect to on an emotional level. So overall, it takes a lot of time to build the world space. There's a lot of elements to address, especially if you want to create a world space from scratch. There's a reason I created an entire free course on this subject matter. But it is important to do so, especially if you want to create any sort of fantasy fiction that's similar to the works of Narnia or Lord of the Rings. And this can be a lot of fun to do. I've often talked about how fun it is to create a new interesting fantasy world, the different places, the connections, the cultures, the people within it. It makes the world feel so much more alive and impactful, so much more immersive for the reader. And it does, in fact, make it a bit easier to write the story, as you can picture it on a map or in the notes that you've made during your world building, and that way you can easily piece together the characters and the scenes that you're trying to write. Now let's talk about blending these genres together. The key to successful genre fusion lies in seamlessly integrating those elements into the fantastical narrative without overshadowing them. So let's go over some techniques to help you do that. To begin with, it's essential to understand the core elements of the chosen genre being fused with fantasy. For instance, if you're blending romance with fantasy, you need to understand how a romance novel is built, strong emotions between characters, and engaging plot that keeps readers hooked. Similarly, if you're mixing horror fantasy, you need to understand how fear operates in storytelling. Once you've identified those core elements and tropes of your chosen genres, it's time to explore techniques for integrating them into your fantasy narrative. One effective way is by using symbolism and metaphor throughout your story. Symbolism can be used as a bridge between two seemingly different genres by creating connections that help readers understand how they complement each other. And then there is pacing. You need to use it effectively. It's important to not rush into certain scenes that have a certain genre dominating it. For example, if you were working with the horror genre, I often talk about pacing when it comes to horror and thriller. If you're working with the horror genre into fantasy, you've got to understand that sometimes the fantastical elements are going to be having a slower pacing, so you can build up that world space, build up that feeling. But in certain horror scenes, you'll find that the pacing speeds up. This is because you want the reader to feel energized. You want them to feel scared. The character is running. They're being pursued by someone fast and dangerous. But in the slower scenes, you've got to be able to build the tension as well. So that's some balance that you need to figure out if you want to make sure that these things blend together well. Because if you try to write a horror scene as a fantasy writer, you'll find that your horror scene has a lot less impact. And all of this should make sense to you because after all, if you're planning to write a fantasy novel, you need to understand how a fantasy novel works. If you're planning to write science fiction, you need to understand how that genre works. So if you're going to include different genres and fuse them together, you need to understand how all those genres work. Otherwise, those genres are not going to add to your story or complement the fantasy elements, but in fact going to detract from the story and bring everything down. The power of genre fusion lies in the ability to also enhance its fantasy story elements. Your characters, your plot, your atmosphere. You took the time to build the world, now you got to show it off. By blending elements from other genres, you can create a more diverse and engaging world, yes. However, if those elements are a lot more interesting and distract from the world that you've worked so hard on, then once more, this is a genre that's going to actually bring down your story rather than raise it up. So take a closer look at the elements that are very important to your story and how they fit in the fantasy world space and make sure they stand out on a pedestal. These are creative plot devices that integrate seamlessly into any type of genre. Your characters, your MacGuffins, your antagonist, the places in your world space. These are going to be the other bridges that we've talked about that blend the genres together. You've got to really think about the adaptability of these elements in order to make sure they fit when different genres are being presented. And yes, that is going to be tough to write because you're basically taking, depending on how different your genres are and how they clash with each other in your story, that can be like taking Aragorn from Lord of the Rings and placing him in Star Wars. You have to be really adaptable as a writer in order to create such adaptable characters and themes. The execution needs to be flawless or it's going to be ugly. One approach to help you with this though is foreshadowing. It helps build up momentum. It makes the reader feel like they're not just being thrown in the deep end. It feels like this has been coming for a long time and they kind of just slip into it. When you're doing an extreme genre fusion, the only time you really want to shock the reader with something surprising is if there's a twist, but not when you include a new element every time. Maintaining this balance between your fantasy story and the other genre elements is a crucial thing to do in order to create a cohesive narrative, but also to keep your reader interested. You don't want them to think that your story is a mess. It's very easy as well if you're including a genre that clashes badly with your story to overshadow those elements that you've worked so hard on. So the way to avoid this pitfall is to stay true to your fantasy elements. After all, this is a genre fusion, but there is going to be one genre that dominates the other. You can't have such a terrible clash between the two, otherwise you won't have them blending in so well. These are going to be elements, these are going to be themes, these are going to be characters, plot devices that work well across all genres. At least all the genres that are included in your genre fusion. And now that we're talking about different pitfalls that you might face with genre fusion, let's talk about these setbacks and how to overcome them. As with any writing technique, genre fusion in fantasy writing comes with its own set of challenges. While blending multiple genres can lead to unique and captivating stories, it can also lead to trouble maintaining that consistency, avoiding the cliches, and managing your readers' expectations. So let's explore some common challenges you might face in genre fusion and provide some strategies and solutions for overcoming them. So let's talk about the number one here, which is maintaining that consistency. When blending different genres within a fantasy story, it's crucial to ensure that the fantastical elements remain consistent and don't clash with the new elements introduced. For example, if you're fusing romance with fantasy, make sure the romantic plotline doesn't overshadow the fantastical world building or feel out of place within it. Once more, stick to the core aspects of your story. Don't let your fusion genre overcome the fantasy. Yes, it is okay to use a cliche and a trope now and then, but if you're fully dependent on cliches and tropes to maintain that fantasy feeling, then you are definitely going to be struggling when it comes to telling your story, especially if you want the story to stand out and be interesting. You need to be able to push beyond these conventions and create something new. If you're fusing horror with fantasy, and you're going to include tropes like vampires and werewolves into your narrative, it can be a little overdone. Instead, try exploring other aspects of horror, such as psychological horror or cosmic horror, that complement your fantasy world building. You don't have to stick with the tropes in order to fuse these two different genres. Now, when it comes to managing your reader expectations, readers may come into your story expecting certain things based on the genre labels attached to it, such as an epic quest in high fantasy or a twisting murder mystery in crime fiction. So it's important to deliver on those expectations while still offering something fresh and unexpected through your fusion of genres. Now, this can be a little tough to overcome, so it's important to plan ahead, study successful examples in writing, avoid overloading the narrative with all these different elements, and finally, simply take a risk. When you're doing something new, you've got to try something new. So that means you're going to do something that's out of your comfort zone, but it might in the end be the best thing you do for your story. And now for some of my thoughts on genre fusion. As many of you might already know, I am a variety writer. I like to bounce between different story ideas and genres because sometimes I have more ideas on one side of a genre than the other, and that seems to take my interest a lot more than the initial idea. And this back and forth was very challenging in the beginning, so I realized I couldn't really stick to one genre and be happy with my work. I had to follow where the best ideas were, and sometimes they were in different genres. But this has often helped me at times because there are certain scenes in some stories that I want to have a feeling that can only be found in a different genre. So for example, let's say I'm writing a fantasy novel, and 99.9% of the scenes are fantasy. But there is that 0.1%, that one scene that is scary. And the best way I'm going to be able to make sure that scene has impact is by putting on a different hat and writing as a thriller or horror writer. Otherwise, that scene will be, as I said earlier in this video, it'll be like I'm writing it as a fantasy writer. It won't have that impact, it won't feel right. It may blend well within the story, may blend a little too well within the story, that it kind of gets overlooked. But I like to make sure the scenes are written the best way that they can be written. And sometimes that means writing it differently. So when it comes to genre fusion, this ability to wear different hats can certainly come in handy. But if you're already familiar with genre fusion and have written a novel that way, what thoughts would you have on this topic? What advice would you give beginner writers? What challenges did you face when writing your novel? Let us know in the comments below. Now, as I said at the start of this video, I do have a second channel out now where I have scary stories that you can listen to. It's also available on Spotify if you like to listen to your audio fiction there. If you enjoy scary short stories, an original show, or perhaps even creepypastas, then you'll enjoy the Aurora Files. There's a link to that in the description below. With that, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed, be sure to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. As always, I'll see you in the next episode of Writing Today. Good day, good night, and happy writing.